Hello, my name is Taisha, and welcome to the very first Social Work and Voting Matters podcast. On today's episode, I will be discussing prison gerrymandering. Before we get into the topic, I want to give some context. To understand prison gerrymandering, you have to know what gerrymandering is. In layman's terms, gerrymandering is the one-upping of a political opponent by their rival because the electoral deck was stacked against them. So basically, if I'm running for office and my opponent has more electoral votes because he's managed to either pack a certain population into one area or crack the same population, just means that he or she watered down the population that would vote for me. That's gerrymandering. They end up getting political power through breaking up the vote or packing it into one area and then thereby weakening the vote that way. So that usually happens with on both sides, on both parties. You'll see it happening with Democrats. You'll see it happening with Republicans. Mostly, what you see now is what Republicans are doing. One example of Democrats doing that is how Staten Island this year was redistricted. But um, that will be another subject for another time. It's very interesting, but we're going to get right back into this prison gerrymandering and what it is. So, just so you know, prison gerrymandering is a subcategory of gerrymandering. It's all legal. I almost forgot to talk about that. It's all legal. It's been around for such a long time. I would want to say it goes back to prior to the Constitution, or at least after the Constitution, but it's definitely been around for a long time. But to get back to prison gerrymandering, it's the practice of using incarcerated individuals to inflate the population in a primarily rural area, even though those individuals do not live in that area or did not come from that area, and also those individuals are not able to vote. It usually helps the rural area, get political power while minimizing the power of the surrounding areas or the bigger cities throughout that state. And when people talk about prison gerrymandering, they usually bring up what is called a three-fifth clause. Just to refresh your memory about that, the three-fifth clause was in place when slavery was legal, and in order for slave holders to have some type of political clout because they knew that emancipation was going to come, or the Northerners would fight to keep power. What they did was add that three fifths. Every uh, slave was three-fifths of a person, so that gave people power. And how does this relate to prison gerrymandering? Well, if you recall, I said that individuals who cannot vote is still being counted, but they don't vote. So it's like they don't matter. So that's exactly what happened with the three-fifth clause. Even though slaves were counted as three-fifths of a person, they did not have the right to vote. And that is reminiscent, and that's what prison gerrymandering does in terms of make it reminiscent to where people's humanity, if you want to be very honest about it, is taken away from them because they have the right to vote, but because they've been incarcerated, that is no longer, that's not an issue, and people can gain power while these other people do not have. So, how does this happen? How does prison gerrymandering happen? Well, it's a combination of two factors. One of the first factors is the census, and the other factor is mass incarceration. But first we're gonna talk about the census because it's two things that goes on with the census. Now, to be quite honest, prison gerrymandering via the census as being a contributing factor, it's an indirect cause. So let's talk about that. When people are incarcerated, of course, when it's time to do the census, that becomes an issue. So there's two things that usually the Census Bureau thinks about when they're counting individuals every 10 years. The, and that's the usual residence rule and group quarters rule. The usual residence rule is the allocation of people to where they usually eat and sleep at the time of the census, which, when you think about it logically, it doesn't seem like a bad thing because mostly people sleep and eat at their homes, right? So it makes sense when you're talking about that. If I'm just being very simplified terms. And then there's this thing called group quarters, which is the allocation given to individuals who reside in barracks, hospitals, nursing homes, and again, prisons. How these things come to pass and can cause the census to be an issue, at least for prisoners, is that when you talk about individuals that are incarcerated, that is not where they're sleeping and eating at the time when they are in prison, is not their permanent home. So even though they are counted as the prison, or counted as if the prison um, is their home, that is not the truth. They should be counted as back in where they really were. So that would be their last mailing address, or even more so, where they come from. Where did they live? Did they live in Chicago, Illinois? Did they live in the house with their parents? Whatever the case may be, they should be counted where they are, where they were from, not actually the prison cell that they're in. Now, group quarters also makes sense because there are individuals who serve for the country, or they're expats, or due to illness, they're in a nursing home or in a hospital. They still are allowed to vote, and their vote count for where they live, but not the hospital or the country they're stationed in, and their vote will count. This only comes into play when, one, the census looks at the usual residence rule, and most definitely when it comes to prisons. So that's usually how this is this becomes an issue. It's also important to note that when the census is done, they release that information to the states. The states don't necessarily have to use that information to do redistricting. But that's exactly what they do. And usually, because the information that from the census is flawed, because they've used the usual residence rule, or they use, to a certain extent, the group quarters rule, redistricting is based on bad information that's gotten from the census because they have miscounted individuals as the area. Now, again, it goes back to the state. The state doesn't have to use that information for to do redistricting, but that's what exactly what they do, and because of that, certain areas, rural areas, will benefit versus some more city areas might lose a seat or two because of the people not being counted where they should be. So I think we have talked about the census pretty much. I think what I want to do now is then talk about mass incarceration. So, mass incarceration is a direct cause of prison gerrymandering. It provides the populations, black and brown populations, for prisons to or prison gerrymandering to happen. Inmates are moved from the areas closest to their homes slash families to the areas that are diametrically opposed to what they are used to. So, who benefits from this? So, if you notice, I had talked about rural areas, and we're going to stay on that for the most part. Rural areas that might have been in decline years ago due to mass incarceration has now be well, maybe not thrive financially, but politically they have actually been thriving because what now their population that they did not have from before, it has now exploded based on the prison population that has grown. So when elected officials use a population that is not for just for the bodies, but not really for the vote so much, that's called a phantom population because yes, they're physically there, people know they're there, but they can't vote. But because they're well, like I said, and I'm repeating, because they are counted as bodies, this gives the area enough of enough political clout to say, okay, we have these people, they don't vote. Nobody talks about that. They don't vote, but we have the bodies. And so that in turn gives a rural area not only political power, but that political power is weighted more than say the surrounding areas or even the cities where the inmates come from because now they have clout. So keep that in mind because that does come back in terms of just legislation and how that will basically impact going forward if legislation gets passed or if it gets shuffled off to the side. So we talked about the benefits. Rural people who live in rural areas with prisons in them, they may not have necessarily liked that idea in the beginning, but if certain citizens are concerned about political clout, then having prisons is not such a bad idea over the long term. But now there's the consequences. So who bears the consequences most of the time when you have prison gerrymandering? Of course, black and brown people. African Americans and Latinos are usually bear the brunt of prison gerrymandering in the form of one, they are not represented by the elected official that they help uh, get into office. So what usually happens there, because the elected official does not need their vote, that he needs their bodies, but he doesn't need their vote. that elected official is not accountable to them. So most likely, what will happen is if an inmate or two, if a black and brown inmate has some issues going on, they want to make a complaint about the power structure. I'm just making this up, but if they want to complain about the power structure, they can't go to that elected official that just got into office because of their physical presence. They actually have to go back to where they came from, get reach out to the elected official in the area that they actually came from, and try to get some type of help through that elected official rather than the official who actually won based off of their presence in their town. So usually, of course, who benefits from this? Well, usually um, Caucasian elected officials, especially these areas that are in the rural areas where the population, the population of black and brown people may, the best word I guess could be for it is minuscule. That they are, the population is one small, but the black people and the brown people is maybe less than one or two. So that's who you have to think about in terms of the benefits of it. Usually white people are benefiting. Um, the area in itself, in terms of the political power of, say, we'll call it now rural area A versus rural area B, if rural area B actually have the people, it's not going to be weighed as much as rural area A because they don't have the people, but they got the phantom numbers or the phantom population going for them. So this comes back to the legislative part. Say if rural area A wants to fund, you know, a a casino, so to speak. We'll just use that. And rural area B is like, no, they don't want to do it. Most likely because rural area A has the political power and and it's weighted more, they will actually get what they want. And also, you could look at it this way. Say if rural area B wants to say, no, we don't like this situation where rural area A is using the population of the prison to get them to puff up their population and taking power away from me. They could fight it and they should fight it, but also rural area A is also going to do the same thing, and most likely they're going to vote to keep that system in place. So rural area A, because of their power, might be able to get legislation passed at that benefits them and no one else, either in the surrounding areas or somewhere in the other part of the state where people, black and brown people, may need resources more so than what rural area A needs. So, when we talk about the problem, and of course, prison gerrymandering is a problem, we got to think about it in the bigger, like in the bigger equation of things. And so, prison gerrymandering in general, is a part of voter suppression. And we look at voter suppression and well, we do talk about voter suppression in terms of gerrymandering because we look at the political aspect of it, which is, and honestly speaking, so is prison gerrymandering. It's a political aspect of all of it. However, this is when we think about when we think about voter suppression, we don't talk enough about how these little topics that people talk about, people may know about, how they are so prevalent across the United States, like just across the board. Um, Prison gerrymandering is an issue. Even though when you think of New York, you think, oh, yeah, this couldn't possibly happen in New York. Yes, it did happen in New York, and it happened upstate New York too. However, it was voted out of existence for now. So don't think that your favorite blue state will not do prison gerrymandering, because it will, and it probably has. But certain states have taken steps to address this situation. But again, you want to, when you think about prison gerrymandering, you want to think about it not as just prison gerrymandering, but being the the smaller piece of a bigger puzzle. It's just, you may not know about it. You may have just learned about it. You might be learning about it now as I'm talking about it. But this is a thing. It happens, and it impacts, of course, mostly black and brown communities because of mass incarceration. So, okay, we've talked about the problems, we talked about the consequences, and we talked about the benefits, or who benefits from prison gerrymandering. So, now let's talk about solutions. So, this is going to sound very radical to some. It does kind of sound radical to me. I'm still thinking about, if is this something to do, but guess what? Uh, Two states have done it. So that's Vermont and Maine. Vermont and Maine has allowed their inmates to vote. So prison gerrymandering actually does not exist in those two states, because they allow their uh, their inmates to vote. Is this a solution that could be long term? Possibly. I think that's something that a lot of people will find hard to swallow. And I'll be honest with you, I still kind of find it hard to swallow, because I do think people go to jail for a reason. How they're treated in jail is a different subject, but you go to jail, and you have to deal with some of the consequences, and not being able to vote during that time is one of those consequences. But by the same token, if there's a population that is being actually taken advantage of, that's why you could see why Vermont and Maine are looking at, or have allowed their inmates to vote. So it all depends on how you feel about it. But again, Vermont and Maine are allowing their inmates to vote. So that's where prison gerrymandering doesn't exist. Now, as I was talking earlier, and how I mentioned earlier, New York City, I mean, not just New York City, I'm sorry, New York State and Connecticut, they have taken steps. What are those steps? Well, they did something that most states haven't done yet, and they have allowed, they have used the census information, and instead of counting people, their inmates, while they're in prison for that area, they allow those people to be counted from where they're from. So if they're from Brooklyn, if inmate 12345 is from Brooklyn, he's gonna be counted as a resident of Brooklyn. Or if number inmate 6789 is from Queens, that inmate is going to be counted as a resident of Queens. So they're taking those steps to ensure that that people are counted where they're supposed to be rather than the jail cell that they're in. And then, okay, in terms of legislation, there is the HR 1 Act or For the People's Act. And that honestly is great legislation. However, it's languishing in Congress. And so now that we have a Republican run Congress, even though by the slimmest margins, I'm not too sure how that's going to work out going forward. Uh, it could happen, but we have a Republican Congress, so I wouldn't hold my breath on that. But to to talk about that, well, to take that to the next level, there's always civic engagement. You heard me, there's civic engagement. So, what would you do or should you do? You should go out there and vote. And please think about voting in terms of not just midterms. Midterms are important, yes, because we're still into midterms because Georgia is going to decide tomorrow or when you hear this today who's going to be their senator. It could be Herschel Walker or it could be Reverend Raphael Warnock. That's a side note. But again, so yeah, go out and vote because you need to do that. That's how you keep your power. Voting is just one step, but it's an important step. So now, how do we tie this all back in to voting and social work, which is uh, the name of this podcast? Well, it's two things. We need to think about voting again as just a piece of a puzzle. And with social work, we got to think about it in terms of advocacy. So now, usually, just to back up for a second, when we think about social work and voting, we think about getting out the vote. And by no means do I want to minimize that because that is very important. However, there's also the advocacy piece. And the advocacy piece is about one, learning what issues are impacting you or will impact your family. That's the most important piece. And once you know that whatever the issue is, you have to advocate for yourself. And this is where social work comes in. So, from my perspective, I'm all about community organizing. That's my track. So, community organizing, for me, the advocacy piece will always be in the forefront of everything. However, I can understand if a person who is in clinical wonder like how can I do this or how can I make this um, how can I make this work for my client? Well, it might be a little bit more difficult, but I think the best thing you could do if you have a client and you're seeing that and you're seeing them on individual, whatever the case may be, through individual sessions. The thing to connect to them is to go back to what I just said. You might have a client who may want to advocate for themselves in regards to the having a certain medication made available to them through Medicaid or through whatever, and it's in Congress. You as a social worker could tell them how to, or give them the ways or give them the tools to advocate for themselves, because that people, everybody need advocacy and or need to know how to advocate for themselves. So it doesn't have to be in the realm of just community organizing. It could just be in the realm of you're advocating for yourself, and to know what legislation is going to impact you, whether it be legislation regarding medicines. Your client should know that, and your client should, hopefully your client, once they know what to do and how to do it, they could advocate for themselves and make uh, make people accountable to them, make their their local legislator accountable to them, because they have a vote, and that vote is not going to be taken away from them because they're not incarcerated. So those are the things we need to look at in terms of making sure, as social workers, we talk about the importance of voting, that we talk about the importance of knowing different issues and how they impact us and how they will impact our clients, and what tools we need to give our clients so they can do the self advocacy journey on their own. Of course, maybe if they need you to help, you're there to assist. But to do that where they can be self sustainable and fight for their own issues, we need to think about that. And that's how social work can be a part of, or does not have to be separate from, voting or political issues at best, or any political issues. So I've now come to the end of this podcast. I hope that you enjoyed it. I just want to add a couple of things in terms of what you can do if you want to learn more about civic engagement. Please go to New York City Votes. There's a great uh, it's a great agency, and I think it's non-partisan, where it's through New York City, and they give you information around voting. Please feel free to go on 311, and I think you could go on the web, NewYorkNYC.com, and you can look up NYC Votes. They're a good agency to get information from, and just keep in mind that voting matters, but so do social work. So thank you so much. Have a good evening, and I hope to hear you back here again. And this will not be the last podcast that I do. Thank you. Good night.